I'd like to have some practical examples of what peacekeeping involves. Like, do you go around with weapons to
No.
keep? So
I did say civilian.
okay. So also in regards to literacy, what do the volunteers do? I'm asking these questions because I get the idea that you have to have a very specific area in which you've worked already to become a volunteer.
With UNV, to become a UNV volunteer, as I mentioned, you have to be able to meet the requirements of the job description. And you have to have at least 5 years' experience. That would be one of the requirements of the job description. So in that way, yes, you're absolutely right. So if you're working in peace building and peacekeeping, there's a lot of electoral support given, for example, or reconciliation between groups that have been in conflict, or
So what do you do specifically, though? I mean, when you say reconciliation, do I sit down and talk to them, or?
I don't have specific information with me at the moment. If you go onto our website, there's probably a lot of stories about UNV volunteers in that area that might give you a very specific. I don't know if you have anything with you.
Well, maybe a little bit, if I could just
Yeah,
pick up
please.
what Donna is saying there. Because you see, the way the UNV was established, right, there was a particular time, the 1970 time coincided with the former colonial countries coming on stream. And at that time, many of them being new countries were facing severe technical shortfall in capacity. And that's why the insistence on technical competence, because they were gap fillers, they were intended to go in and do mid-level type jobs. And therefore you have to be able to be independent, be competent in the field, and be able to work unsupervised, essentially, as well as trained counterparts. And it also explained a little bit the age, because we started with much older volunteers and the age limit is coming down. So you take that profile, and as you can imagine, the spread, education, health, areas out there. So in the when we go into peacekeeping, we don't do the actual policing. Remember, there's sometimes a UN force, right? Or there's, in the case of many of the African countries now, there's an African force. They do the actual physical. What we do is we are more in the peace building in support of the peacekeeping. And by this we mean that there are programs that have various elements in them. So our volunteers sometimes fall in the same areas as they do for the development areas. You may have people in the area of education, you may have people working with children, etc. So you need competence in those areas. Community relations, for instance. We work largely with UNHCR also. It's one of the principal UN agencies. So protection, for instance, and being able to work with the people who are still living in the refugee camps and so on. So those specific types of activities which are spelled out in the job description.
It could be something like sports for peace and development. You know, where maybe what they're looking for is someone who has a physical education training, but also has that psychological training as well, so that you're using sports as a way to bring people together in a community, just as a hypothetical, but that would be the sort of, to try and make it a little bit more concrete. So we're not saying you have to have, although they might ask for a PhD in psychology or something, but that's not the only vacancy that's available. So there would be a lot of different things. I mean, it may be going around and letting people know that now we're having elections for the first time in a country after quite a few years of conflict.
And you need 5
People
years?
need to know that they're going to be safe when they go to vote. People need to know what the voting procedure is going to be, and why they can exercise that right, why they might want to exercise that right. So you might need communication skills. You might need campaigning skills. You might need, different skills like that. It really depends on what the UN agency is asking of us. I'm trying to make it sound very diverse because it is very diverse. Yeah.
I
Just follow,
understand.
because you asked the question of do you have to have 5 years? On the elections front and in many of the crises areas, you're quite correct. Sometimes if the assignment is 2 months or 6 months, right, you may be able to find someone who doesn't have 5 years. So I may not be required to absolutely have 5 years, because there could be some complementary training that goes with that. However, what we're finding is that you do need people, as Donna was saying, who've been experienced enough to be able to go into these sensitive areas. Because governments are very, very critical about people overstepping acceptable areas, so that you may be, and we've had instances of where we had to step in and protect our volunteers, because the perception out there is that they're interfering by what they say and how they say what they say, especially if you're in elections, for instance. Because we send in people to to train with the ballot, but this is the box, this is how you do it, not what you do when you walk into the ballot, into the booth to cast your vote, etc. So we really have to support the people going in as volunteers in terms of how they convey the message and how they manage themselves, whether they're actually in front of the community or an individual in the community, or even when they're in their private time.
Okay, we have a couple of questions here. We'll go here and then back.
In terms of experience, how do you count master's degrees versus or as compounding or as complementary to experience? Is there a number of years that's counted for that, or is that just counted as an academic base?
Again, it depends on the job description that the UN organization has put forward. Most often it will require a master's, but it may not if there's a more technical skill that they're looking for and a technical training related to that technical skill. So that, again, imagine applying for a paid position and the employer says, I want someone to have a master's. Well, then that will be required. And I want someone to come with 5 years experience, or I want someone to come with 3 years experience if it's a certain special circumstance, or longer than that. So it might be that you've had experience not directly linked to a master's if you're just finishing a master's, and it's that technical area that the job requires, but your experience has been such which makes the organization comfortable that we're going to refer your CV to, that says to them this person has a certain maturity or a certain related experience which makes us feel that they would do very well in this job, and now they added the technical training. Yeah. So it could balance it in that way, but it really depends on the job description and the agency.
And we'll go.
What's the typical length of the assignments? Like how short can they be and how long can they be? And secondly, have you seen young UN volunteers end up getting a job immediately after they spend a certain amount of time at these agencies?
Good questions. The typical assignment is 2 years. In special operations, it can be 3 months to 6 months. Often what happens in special operations is a group will go from one country to another, so it can be extended. The maximum amount of years you can spend as a UNV volunteer is it 6 or 8? 8 years. Again, because we don't want it to be a career, it's a volunteer position. But I think some people get hooked, they really love it. And so they get used to living within the means of the living allowance and the housing allowance. But we don't want it to be a career, we want it to be a volunteer experience. So it's a maximum of 8 years. And as I said, most assignments are 2 years in length, other than the special operations one, which tends to be a little bit shorter. Do people get jobs afterwards? Certainly, I wouldn't want you to think, oh, here's my gateway to a UN job. Does it happen? Yes. Does it happen as frequently as maybe you would want? Probably not. But again, in looking for a job, if you apply for a job in with a UN organization and you have on your resume that you served as a UNV volunteer with another UN agency, that's going to add to the experience that they're looking for. And the fact if you've got a good reference and so on, it's telling them that you can handle yourself in those kinds of circumstances. So it gives you a bit of an edge over maybe some of the other candidates, but it's not a guarantee that you will get a job.